Why is Goblin Piledriver never sad? Because he has protection from the blues.
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. with free weekly content and free shipping on orders over $150. You can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. In today's exciting gameplay, we have Fred, Chris, and Reese rejoining us. Fred has brought out his Ruric Thar deck, keeping Boreal Druid, 2 Forests, Llanowar Elves, Reflecting Pool, Dimir Sabertooth, and a Jiraga Treespeaker. Chris is playing Captain Sisay, keeping 3 Visits, Plains, Dragonlord Dramoka, Seedborn Muse, Court of Calling, a Chroma's Memorial, and a Wooded Bastion. I am playing Halana and Alena Partners, keeping a Forest, Wooded Ridgeline, Dustshell Crawler, Cami of Whispered Hopes, Broodlord, All Will Be One, and Sylvan Library. Last but not least, Reese is playing his Obosh deck, keeping Fire Covenant, Soul Ring, Sulphurous Mire, Snow-Covered Mountain, Mountain, Feed the Swarm, and a Charcoal Diamond. Fred wins the die roll and starts us off. He draws, plays a Forest, and casts Llanowar Elves. Chris just plays a Plains. I draw and play a Wooded Ridgeline. Reese plays a Sulphurous Mire and passes back to Fred. Fred has a Temple of Abandon for turn, scrying 1 and keeping it on top. He then plays out a Jiraga Treespeaker, and then Boreal Druid, and passes. Chris's turn has him playing a Wooded Bastion, and then paying 2 for 3 visits. He goes to find a Canopy Vista, passing to me after that. I draw, play a Forest, and cast turn 2 Sylvan Library. Reese plays a Snow-Covered Mountain and taps it for a Soul Ring. He then taps that for a Charcoal Diamond and passes to Fred. Fred plays a Reflecting Pool and then pays to level up the Jiraga Treespeaker and passes to Chris. Chris draws, but without a land to play, only casts Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and passes to me. I draw and play a Mountain. I pay 3 for a Cami of Whispered Hopes, and pass. Reese draws and plays a Mountain. He then taps enough for a Fire Servant, and passes back to Fred. Fred draws and plays a Forest. He then casts his commander, Ruric Thar, and then plays out Orcish Lumberjack, passing to Chris after that. Chris draws and plays a Brushland. He then pays enough for Captain Sisay, and passes. My turn has me drawing from the Sylvan Library and paying 4 life to keep an extra card. I then play a Mountain and cast my commanders, Halana and Alena, and then move to combat. I get their trigger and put it on the Cami, giving it 2+1/+1 counters, which becomes 3 because of its own ability, but I don't attack with it. Moving to my second main phase, I then tap the Cami, casting a Pure Strain Genestealer and passing to Reese. Reese draws and plays a Mountain. He does some math and casts Fire Covenant, and between the Ruric Thar trigger and paying life into his own spell, he drops down to 19 to wipe the board. He then goes to combat and swings his Fire Servant at me, dealing 4 and passing. Fred draws and plays a Mountain. He then casts an Ilsean Carotid and passes to Chris. Chris's turn has him playing Plaza of Heroes, and he pays 5 for the All-Star that is Seedborn Muse. I draw and pay 8 into my Sylvan Library to keep the whole 3 cards. I then play a Forest for turn and cast Hardened Scales and then a Greater Good. I pass, and during my end step, Chris casts Court of Calling, putting 3 into the X, and goes to find a Somberwall Sage. Reese draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Obosh, and then plays out Chaos Dragon and goes to combat. We each roll a d20, with Chris rolling the highest, so he's safe from the dragon hit. This has Reese swinging the Fire Servant and Dragon at me, and I take the hit, and he passes. Fred draws, and in his main phase, casts Runic Armasaur, passing back to Chris after that. Chris draws, and plays Avacyn, Angel of Hope in his main phase. He then hits me for 2 with Seedborn, and passes. Chris untaps with me, thanks to his Seedborn Muse, and I draw but can't really afford to pay any more life into the Sylvan library. I then play a Rampant Rejuvenator, which enters with an extra counter, and I pass after that. Rhys draws and goes to combat, and he rolls the highest, meaning he can swing at anyone. He swings it and Obosh at Fred, and with nothing else, he passes. Fred draws and plays Cinder Glade, which comes in untapped. He then plays out Xenagos, God of Revels, and passes. Chris draws and plays a Plains in his main phase. He then plays Captain Sisay, and then Dose into the Fallen Leaf, and goes to combat. He swings Avacyn at Rhys for 8, who takes the hit. He then passes, and during his end step, I sacrifice my Rampant Rejuvenator to the greater good, going to find 3 lands, and then drawing 3 and discarding 3. With Fred getting to draw a card from the Armasaur as I do so. I draw and play Rhythm of the Wilds. I then cast Incubation Druid, and I give it the +1/+1 counter from the Wilds trigger, and I pass after that. Rhys draws and plays Molten Psyche, so each of us shuffle our hands and draw a new one. He then plays a Solemn Simulacrum, going to find a basic, and then goes to combat. This time around, I roll the highest to his Chaos Dragon, and he swings it at Fred once more. With nothing else, Rhys passes. Fred draws and plays a Forest. He then taps a lot of mana for a Nyxbloom Ancient, and follows it up with an Elder Gargoth. And he decides not to attack, knowing that he, Rhys, and I have to team up and take out the common enemy that is Chris. With nothing else, he just passes. Chris draws and activates Captain Sisay. He gets Bruna the Fading Light, putting it to hand, and then casting it, and he reanimates Thalia. And when she's out, plays Llanowar Elves and an Arbor Elf. Going to combat, he swings Avacyn at Fred for 8, which he takes after declaring no blocks. With nothing else, Chris passes. I draw and play a Forest, and then recast Halana and Alena. I then play out a Voldaran Thrillseeker, and put the counters onto Halana and Alena. I then follow up by casting Rampant Growth to go and find a Forest, and Chris decides to activate Sisay, going to find Gisela to hopefully get the full Brizilla setup, and I then move to combat. I put the +1/+1 counters onto the Thrillseeker, and then just pass to Rhys. Rhys draws and goes to combat. We roll for the Chaos Dragon, and I end up being the only one he can swing at. I'm forced to kill it by sacrificing my Voldaran Thrillseeker, and Fred gets a card from the Armasaur. With nothing else, Chris then activates Captain Sisay again, tutoring for Shalai, and Rhys passes to Fred. Chris untaps on Fred's untap step, and Fred then draws and plays a Forest. He then plays a Shia, and follows it up with an Augur of Autumn, and then Goreclaw. He then recasts Ruric Thar, and then once he's out, plays Wood Elves, going to find a Forest. Chris also wants to do some tutoring, activating Captain Sisay to go and find Growing Rights of Itlamok. Using some of his floating mana thanks to the Nyxbloom Ancient, Fred then casts Mina and Den, and he moves to combat. He puts the Xenagos trigger on any other creature, but decides to swing the Elder Gargoth at Rhys, and Rhys blocks with a Solemn Simulacrum, so they both draw a card. With nothing else, Fred passes. Chris draws and plays Growing Rights of Itlamok. He gets a Collector Oof off of it, and then plays Shalai, and then Gisela. Going to combat, he swings Avacyn at Fred and Bruna at Rhys. Fred chumps with a Gargoth, and Rhys takes 5. Chris then moves to his end step, and Bruna and Gisela meld into Brizella. He also gets to transform his Growing Rights into Itlamok, Cradle of the Sun. I draw and play a Rockfall Vale. I then cast a Doomscar Warrior and back up on Halana and Alena, and give the warrior haste from Rhythm of the Wilds. Moving to combat, I put the Halana and Alena trigger on the warrior, and once it resolves, sacrifice it to Greater Good to draw 14 and discard 3. Chris then activates Shalai twice to pump his team, and in my second main phase, I then play out a Benevolent Hydra, putting 7 into the X. Rhys draws and plays a Swamp. With nothing else, he passes, and Chris continues to pump his team with Shalai. Fred draws and plays a Rootbound Crag. He then plays a Beast Whisperer, and then plays a Mountain as his second land for turn. He follows up by casting Wandering Archaic, and then an Endraiser Forerunners for a small overrun on his team. This has Chris activating Shalai twice in response, and Fred continues to chain off, casting Kiki Jiki, and then Urabras the Hidden. He then uses Kiki Jiki to make a copy of the Forerunners, pumping up his team again, and he goes to combat. He puts the Xenagos trigger onto Ashaya, and swings all out at Chris. After lining up blocks, Chris finds that there's still enough damage to take him out, and he blocks in such a way to take out Ruric Thar, the Nyxbloom Ancient, Ashaya, and Augur of Autumn. With the archenemy of the table finally taken out, Fred then casts a Birds of Paradise, and then a Collector Oof, and he then passes to me. I draw and play Kessig Wolfrun for turn. I then play an Unnatural Growth, and once that resolves, cast Overwhelming Stampede, giving my creatures +10/+10 and trample. I pay the 2 for the Wandering Archaic, and then play out a Blasphemous Act, and pay the 2 to that one as well. My creatures are big enough at this point to live through it, and I wipe everything else out. Going to combat, I put the Halana and Alena trigger ability on the Hydra, but resolve the Unnatural Growth first, doubling my creature's power. And I'm then able to swing my massive creatures at Fred and Reese's open boards, winning the game. Game review time. This game was 56 minutes and 23 seconds. And I think I was incredibly lucky to have won that game. I think a lot of it was down to the fact that I had that Voldaren Thrillseeker save me from the Chaos Dragon, and I just love that card and the backup mechanic. It's so flavorful, it's so much fun, and it works so well in Halana and Alena. Chris's Legendary Matters Captain Sisay deck was brutal. Once that Seedboard Muse was out and he was able to start tutoring on everyone else's turn, things just got out of hand. As soon as that Shalai resolved, I thought the game was over, and I have to say I did not see Fred pulling off that kill the way that he did. It seemed like he just dumped his hand, and the Nyxbloom Ancient and Beast Whisperer really churned out some value in his deck. Plus the Kiki Jiki and Urabras really didn't hurt, giving all of his creatures haste, and then that Vigilance, Trample, and +2/+2. Reese's Obosh deck looked like it had a lot of things going on for it, but unfortunately he just didn't manage to get there. It seemed like he was missing a critical element or two. I'm not sure whether it was draw or some reliable way to start blasting face. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.